Who's overwhelmed right now? A little bit. There's a lot of us. So, some of you have probably put this together. We've made reference to it. Perhaps you've shown up consistently enough that you've noticed, hey, there's a lot of different people who sometimes stand up and talk at me on a Sunday morning. We sort of wanted to close the loop on that and just make it abundantly clear what's going on. Who are all of these people, and why is this happening to me, to you, every week? So this Watershed, this is our teaching team. Yeah. Missed opportunity to do like a Joe Bluth thing right there. My bad. You didn't understand that reference, but you two did. Thank you. Real quick. Yeah, sorry. So real quick, as we get started, this isn't always what teaching or preaching at Watershed looked like. It used to be more, I don't know, monolithic, homogeneous, monotonous. What would happen would be you'd get Matt, and then you'd get Scott, and then you'd get Matt again, and sometimes we'd throw you a curveball and you would get Scott 2 weeks in a row. It was so fun that people actually created bingo games when it came to certain Mattisms and Scottisms, words that they would say. For Matt, it was kind of more Kentuckyisms. With Scott, a little bit more of a robust vocabulary, but off to a great start. But Matt, I'm gonna risk after teeing you up like that, I'm gonna risk retaliation and ask you just real briefly, how did we get from there to whatever this is?
Well, thank you, I think. So, again, my name is Matt O'Neill, and I'm one of the founding pastors. I've been here since 2005 when we started Watershed. Much to what David described, that was kind of the reality moving into this. We thought we were kind of ahead of the curve when there was just two of us talking, as opposed to, growing up in environments where you had this one particular authoritarian voice within the church. And felt like, wow, that's a real click and a progressive version of what the church could be back in those days. And I think somewhere around 2016, 2017, we started to recognize that, man, like there's so many other voices here in this community. And the way that really surfaced for us, just in the name of transparency, wasn't because Scott and I were sitting in a room going, we should include more voices here. What happened was we had this very loving community of women that started to have this conversation amongst themselves and say, maybe there's a different way forward here, a better way forward. And through some really profound interactions with that community of women, we started to move towards a expression of communication, authority, voice, pontification, teaching in a way that included more than just Scott and myself. And it was at that time it was a breath of fresh air, because in all honesty, we weren't dying to be up here every Sunday and us being the lone voice as well. We were ready for that to sort of take place, and it didn't happen overnight. Sean became the first person that we moved towards as a community and said, would you help us in this regard? And then it kind of grew from there. So who we are today is not who we were, obviously, 17 years ago, and it's kind of a testimony to the way things evolve here in terms of a communal expression of who are we, what are we doing, and how do we adjust, how do we evolve.
Yeah. So that's a nice setup and a nice transition. This is going to get more conversational, I hope. But just to kind of kick things off, to let you know who's on stage, who's in the room, what you just said, who we are today is not who we were. And that's true for every person on this stage. Who we are today is not who we were growing up, like relationally, spiritually. Who we are today is not who we were probably when we arrived at Watershed. Watershed as a church is not who it was or what it was in its inception. So maybe to kick things off, just introduce yourself and just one or two sentences real quick about kind of where you were spiritually and maybe where you are today. I was going to call on Sean, but no. It's okay. Oh, super orderly. I'm more chaotic than that. But yeah, we can do that. So, all right, Blair, kick us off.
Surprised? So my name is Blair, and I'm the family ministry pastor here. And I grew up in small town North Carolina on a farm about 30 minutes from the coast, and grew up in a very small town religious background. And from there, just started to question things as I went to college, and then also continued to question things as I moved off to grad school in California. And so that, of course, changed who I was, how I read scripture, and how I saw the world around me.
Good morning. My name is Sean. I've been attending Watershed since year 2. I originally am from Costa Rica. My father is from Ohio, so I have a lot of sort of intersectional identity that shows up maybe visibly in the space. I grew up Catholic, but it was really informed by sort of a Latino blend of charismatic Catholicism that included everything from speaking in tongues to praying the rosary every day in Spanish. It was both confusing and really foundational. I really appreciated having saints that I could go to and pray when I was struggling with something. I would say probably in college, I started adding more of a worldview to that lens. I went to a Presbyterian college and really started getting language around interfaith ideas, talking to people of other faith systems, and just really opening my eyes to a broader worldview. Found Watershed, I think, the year after I graduated, and have been here ever since. And so, yeah, that's me.
Morning, my name is Cedric Lundy, and I'm one of the teaching pastors here at Watershed. And I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And growing up, we attended most of my childhood and adolescence a Free Methodist church, and that was after leaving a predominantly black church and going into a church that we were basically the only black family there until the Alexanders came, and then it was 2 black families for about 25 years that went to this particular church. But a big part of the reason that motivated my parents to even land at that church was just being in a church that had a very authoritarian leader who basically either you got on board with what he said or you left. So my parents chose the door. And they just wanted a community where there was some accountability for the leadership, but then also where they believed their children could get discipled. And so they found that, albeit at a all-white church. That being said, one of the things that my parents told me, because the joke amongst Free Methodists, because I also ended up getting my degree in youth ministry from a college affiliated with Free Methodists, so they had big rules against basically premarital sex and dancing. And we used to say, they didn't want us to have sex because we might dance, and they didn't want us to dance because we might have sex. All that being said, they also had other rules against drinking, and they would acknowledge hey, it's technically not a sin, but it's against our rules. And one of the things my parents told me that has stayed with me ever since, that kind of gives you an idea of my even journey that I could come from that place to some place like here, is when they became members, and my parents even served, both my mom and my dad served on the elder board for some stints. My mom was even on the regional board of the Free Methodist denomination in that region. Was, Cedric, we're not Free Methodists, we're Christians. And your denomination that we are affiliated with does not define us. We believe Christ, but we don't agree with everything that Free Methodists espouse. We agree enough with them that we can be a part of here. And that always just kind of gave me a ramp to be someone who could continue to learn and be interested in various different streams of Christian thought and not just be rooted in identifying myself in one particular denomination. To cap it off, I got involved with Watershed when I was on staff full-time back in 2016, which kind of to your point, I don't know if you remember this, but originally when I was hired, it was hey, you'll be the pastor over this particular area, and then we'll have you preach 2 times a year. And it was after the second time that you guys were you know what? You're as good, if not better, at this than we are. You just need more reps. We're going to get you up there more often. And you guys followed through with that.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. I grew up in a very rural part of Kentucky, was a part of Baptist church kind of worlds growing up. I went off to college at the University of Kentucky, had no ministry future on my radar. It was more of education and coaching. I wanted to be a basketball coach. Through a series of events, wound up in Virginia as part of a parachurch ministry, met Scott and Taryn Hofert. We ended up starting Watershed in a very evangelical way, really saw the world through a conservative evangelical lens. And whoever I am now is in direct correlation with the way this community has either pushed me towards change, invited me towards change, or given me permission in that. And so if there's a question in the future of why am I still here, that would be why it is as well. I wouldn't be who I am without this community. And so it's almost like, well, that's like, what is it? What do you love about your family? It feels more like family than anything else.
Good morning. My name is Kim, and I grew up drunk, not in the church. And so my first interaction and encounter with God was in a 12-step program, and there was a great deal of freedom in defining that and grasping an understanding of that, which I truly appreciate to this day. And when I ended up in a church for 16 years, which was very much my home, until it was no longer safe for me to be there. And so grateful. My wife has already been a part of Watershed for great 14 years, I think. And so when we were searching for a place where we were actually going to be truly loved in a Christian way, we came here. And all the hard work that this team has done, we got to experience and continue to experience it every Sunday.
And I'm David. I grew up in just a broadly non-denominational evangelical context. I was called into ministry by the 2008 recession. When I graduated undergrad, there really wasn't anything else to do. So it felt more profound in the moment, but as I think back, yeah. But I was working at just a big evangelical megachurch. Early on, classic Calvinist Theo bro, carrying around my copy of Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology, hoping to strike up a conversation at coffee shops. But that quickly began to unravel as it proved to be just pretty pastorally empty. And as my theology began to evolve, so too did my ethics. Ultimately came to a head in 2016 when I basically was asked to formally renounce any openness to LGBTQIA persons. At this point, not even being fully affirmed in the church to be treated humanely at all. So in classic neurodivergent Enneagram 5 fashion, I said no in the form of a 33-page research paper, the final page of which included my resignation. So we had already found Watershed. We were in Arizona, but found Watershed online at that point. In fact, the very first time we tuned in was the very first time Cedric preached. And we were hooked right away. The problem was we lived 2,000 miles away. So remedied that as quickly as we could. Showed up early, which now we know better. Showed up early on a Sunday morning and never left. So attended here for about 2 years before coming on staff part-time. And now I have a very vague title of associate pastor because we can't figure out what to call me. So, and that's me. So thank you all for that. I do want this to become a little more conversational, not us just kind of taking turns answering questions. So we all sort of set this up where we've been, but now here we are. And there is a reason unique to each one of us why not only are we here at Watershed, but why the church still matters to us. I think on some level, all of us have either witnessed things or perhaps experienced things that would be more than ample justification to take a break permanently or at least temporarily from whatever it is we mean by the word church. And yet here we are not only at a church, but in some way working at, serving at, believing in and inviting others to partner with us in a church space. So why? As you feel led.
I'm comfortable with comfortable silences, but I'm not sure everybody else is. For me, the church has always been a part of my life. And what I mean by church, I don't mean like the institution itself in the four walls, I mean the people. And so whether it was the church I grew up in, like I often say that I've often been told that I am a phenomenal hugger. And I can tell you whose fault it was. It was Rosemary Michaels at the church that I grew up in, who would not let me, as a 6-year-old, go into that building without giving her a hug. And like that's just one of hundreds of people who have shaped me and who have had an impact and influence on my life and me becoming more human, which I believe is the objective of the Christ, for us to be coming more in touch with our humanity. And without getting into the whole long story of it, but throughout 2016, when everything really came to a head for me as a black man in white evangelicalism, there were people that, even though I found myself kind of a church nomad eventually, there was community, Christ-centered community that I had, despite the fact that I didn't have like a home church. So for me, church isn't just relegated to the Sunday morning gathering. It's the people that I do life with.
Check that calendar app.
I think for me, why Watershed specifically, I've never seen a collection of such varied experiences as I have in this space, and people coming into their understanding or their relationship with Christ or the divine or the Spirit through their own doors. Growing up in a Catholic space, it sort of felt lockstep. And so we were all tracking towards confirmation or the next sacrament or the next sort of thing. And there was CCD on Wednesdays and whatnot. And so it felt like collectively we had to all be at a certain point by a certain time. And Watershed has never felt that way. It's also always felt like a container for any questions that I've had or any sort of confusion or any sort of anger or angst or whatever the emotion might be. This place has always been big enough to hold that. I've never not known God. I don't have some of the same language that some of my friends up here have. Like the born again virgin. If you were here for the purity talk, like I had a purity talk, but it wasn't couched in maybe white evangelical spaces. It was a little different for me. I've never not known God, but I feel that this space has always let me hold on to many interpretations of God. And then I will say, like through big life moments, I've always felt like there's been a net to catch me. I was laid off. I teach. I teach at Queen's University of Charlotte, but before that I was a high school teacher. I was laid off with no plan, and it felt really missional, and I was like, okay, well, God thought this was it, so help me out. And it always worked out, right? And then the birth of the twins was unplanned, unexpected. I was uninsured, and that worked out. And then, one of my sons was born and needed life-saving surgery. That worked out. We got him home on Christmas Eve. So there's always been this thread of sort of divine intervention in my life that for me proves an existence of something greater. What I love is that I don't always have to have the right name for that in this space. And I love that I encounter folks who come and say, me too, I don't have a name for it. Or when I serve in Greenhouse and I see children forming their own worldviews and their own relationship with God, it's a beautiful thing. So that's what has kept me here, despite all of its changes, for so long, because that has been fundamentally true, I think, since day one.
I've had many difficult and horrific relationships with alcohol, drugs, bulimia, toxic people, toxic institutions, and I stayed for a long period of time with that. And so I have that mentality when it comes to church, that if I can be around something that is that unhealthy, and I gave it so many chances, that I'm able to give the church as a whole my relationship with Christ and finding people that can challenge me with that and resonate in a way that's incredibly healthy and produces growth. That if I can do it for something unhealthy, I can do it for something healthy. And so that's why I'm still in the church.
I did try to walk away from the church. When I moved back from California, I remember moving back across to the East Coast and thinking, there's not a spot for me. I had gone through this space of feeling like I definitely was called to ministry. I had gone to seminary. I had no idea what the future looked like for me. I got back and I just took an entire month to do nothing and to try to figure out what was next. And I stepped into an elementary classroom, and in my heart, I said, this is still the same thing. I'm still walking alongside families. I'm still with kids. I'm still doing what my heart loves to do. But there was still something that was missing. And I don't know what that is. I don't have the language for it all the time, especially now, because I've realized that the more that I learn, the less that I know. And so I think that the reason that Watershed has become such a meaningful space for me is because it's full of people who are learning, people who are curious, people who are all so different and have such different stories, and people who care and just show up not knowing. And I think that that's a reminder that there's something bigger that's there, which is what I think I've always felt deep down, is church is this reminder that there's something bigger that's there. It's not just me, it's not just about me, but there's this holiness, there's something that just weaves us together.
Kind of to your point, the thing that I love about it is it's in that largeness is embodied in this team, and that we've made that movement towards that. Because I know for me, one of the things that even seeking my quote own liberation, I also wanted folks who aren't cisgender straight folks to also have that same freedom and be able to take up the same amount of space, and also wanted women to be able to have that same kind of space and freedom, because like part of learning and unlearning stuff is also recognizing that those same systems are repeated in different ways. And recognizing that Christ is calling us, or the Christ, the divine, whatever you want to call it, is calling us to that kind of an expression. And it's one thing to give it lip service if it's not embodied from the front.
Or from the ground up. Like that, I think when I hear you guys describe your experience here, you know, when you move into starting something or forming something and your entire worldview is from the top down. And then you realize really quickly that you're just pretending that you know what the heck's going on. And that like, oh yeah, this is how we should do things. And in private, you're like, man, we are like spitballing on so many things here. And then you have people that come alongside of you, and you have this relationship, this deep respect, but then you start to be impacted by those people. Well then, all right, how do you invert that, where all of a sudden the ground is rising up through other voices? And you know, the reason I'm still here is because of everything that I've mentioned, but then also I don't have anything else in my life where there's a collective group of people that I can learn from and be changed by. Like, I'm a better hugger today because of certain people on this stage. And now I get to trace that back to somebody. What was her name?
Rosemary Michaels.
Rosemary Michaels. So I'm going to start giving her credit instead of you these days. But like the collective impact, I think, at least for me, is that this flows from a space that is not just up here. It's like, all right, what is happening at the very ground of being in all this? You look like you got something to tee up there.
I was just thinking, like, what you may not know is that we meet once a month, and we get in a room and we talk about series and we plan them out and we ask these questions. What is it that we think our community needs right now or wants to hear, all of these things? And then we have very different responses to those things. I think it works because we fundamentally believe in some very basic principles about what it means to be a good person in relationship with other good people, right? Love God and love everybody else. I think we all agree on basic principles, and then how we see those to fruition or how we see those played out vary because of our experiences, because of language matters, because representation matters, history matters, all of those things. And so it feels like a tapestry of maybe voices that aren't they're collective, but I think hopefully our hope is that you see this sort of common thread, even though David's approach to prayer might be radically different than my approach to prayer, let's just say, right? And we might be able to joke and laugh about it, but there is that notion, right? And hopefully there's something for each person in this space to hold on to, and that it's meaningful. I think that also makes it hard, right? When there's so many different collective voices, and we're sitting around a planning team, and we all have good ideas, and we all have, oh, we should talk about this, or oh, there's not enough this in there. There's a lot of effort that goes behind the scenes that shows up on a Sunday morning, and I appreciate that space to be creative and to agree and disagree and talk, because it's never not been without respect or love.
I'm glad you brought up the challenge of that, because that's just half of it. The other half of it is you all are very diverse. You are showing up with a diversity of stories, faith backgrounds, identities, traumas, aspirations, needs, wants when it comes to what faith, what spirituality, what God means to you. And so there's a part of us that are always trying to, account for that. There's also a freedom that I know I personally experience, both like theologically, but also stylistically, being intimidated by y'all's diversity, and then not feeling like I have to be all things to all people, because I know, like, I'm a terrible storyteller. I include way too many details. And then about halfway through, it's like, this story's terrible. Like, how do I land this plane? And so the fact that I get to minimize that, because literally every other person on this team is a very gifted storyteller, and I can just focus on like big words and stuff, is so, and pop culture references, lots of those. So it's incredibly liberating, incredibly freeing, because otherwise, I don't know, I think I'd be paralyzed just by everything you all bring to the table. And that's kind of a good setup point. So we were trying to, as a team, wrestle with like what would be a good passage of Scripture to sort of interpret or spend some time with or kind of think through when it came to this. And Cedric brought up something super simple. And we're not necessarily going to like camp in it. It's more of like a lens comparatively to kind of see what was going on in Jesus' ministry and kind of what we're trying to do. But in the synoptic gospel, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's passages that just kind of list off Jesus' his disciples, his team. And just right off the bat, especially if you're familiar with the text and the context, it's kind of a crazy list of people. I think we have a slide for this. I think I went with the Matthew one because it was shortest. Am I making that up? No, there it is. So,
Can y'all see that?
I have contact lenses. So these are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas, and Matthew, the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, another surprising one, and then, of course, Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So,
what's not written there is some of those guys naturally, the way they're positioned, hated each other and were enemies. Like, the tax collector, everybody hated him. Everybody else in the group hated him on principle that he's a tax collector because he's basically working for the Roman Empire. And the rest of them are Jewish. In particular, Simon the Zealot was like ready to go to war at the drop of a hat. He was basically the militant one of the bunch, right? And then you have these two sets of brothers, and who knows what kind of like sibling rivalries they got going on in the home, let alone you got another pair of brothers coming into the mix. Right? So like you have all these different guys who have these different takes and these different perspectives and these different backgrounds and different reasons based upon the society that they're growing up in to either look down upon one another, feel superiority about themselves, and or look at another as their mortal enemy. And oh, by the way, another one that Jesus knew was going to betray him. And yet, this is the collection of people that he brings into his life to continue what it is that he was going to start. And we even see it play out and manifested even in the epistles in the New Testament, that they didn't always agree, that they came and approached the things that they were wrestling with differently. But all of that centered around another thing that's often not highlighted, that so many of the new followers in the early church were people who, by in essence converting from whatever religion they practiced to the way, they were disowned by their family, because in the ancient Mideastern world, like, your tribe or nation and your religion were all one. And so if you left one, you left them all. And so now you have all these people trying to figure out how in the world to do life together. And I can remember when I was leaving even the place that I came from to come here, a lot of people were like, but wait a minute. So, like, they go on the website and look for a statement of faith, right? Or doctrinal principles, which if you've ever gone on there, you know it's not there and it's in a story form, if anything. And they're not used to that ambiguity, and they're like, well, how does that even work? And it's as simple as you're not gonna know how it works unless you come and experience it. And when you come and experience it, it makes total sense. I'm not gonna drop it.
Amen.
So,
Oh, I can say something. You want me to talk? So, in that, just listening to Cedric, who I adore and respect so much, I'm right now really resonating with Judas because I betrayed myself so much in my last church without even realizing it. And just knowing that, that every part of the Bible for me has some type of meaning. And for me right now, just knowing that I'm not willing to betray myself, which means I'm not willing to be betrayed or betray you, that allows a connection that's incredibly deep, and that so much of what I've experienced before, and part of what you are talking about is parasympathetic and sympathetic. I'm sure you're aware of that people live in a place of either believing they have to be better than someone else, and you can hear that in the disciples, or they live in a place of everyone's better than me, so let me not try. And this is a group of people who live in a place of godly connection, and so that is here where I can heal from my own betrayal and make sure that no one ever betrays me again, including myself.
so just to kind of, so just to kind of highlight
Also
something.
amen. Also amen.
To kind of highlight something Kim did and demonstrated there. So sort of the underlying thread to all of this morning is a kind of diversity. And there's the surface level diversity at the level of identity, that you see. Maybe a click below that, there is the diversity of experience, maybe the diversity of brain wiring, a diversity of hurt, trauma, a diversity of, aspiration. But then there's a kind of theological diversity born of really all of those things. I mean, we are all kind of a conglomeration of everything that we've been given and bring to the table. And our hope, and I think this plays out on a weekly basis, our hope is that you see that and at times resonate with it, And so, Kim, you're going to hear her say these cool words about psychotherapy and neurobiology, from time to time. And I'm not going to speak for anyone else on the stage, just Kim here, yeah. But sort of in light of this passage, and continue to reflect on it if you want to, but let's talk about those lenses. What lenses are you bringing to the table when it comes to speaking up here?
I think that I speak from a lens of liberation theology as a brown woman. I also think that in the past year and a half, right now, and if you've heard me talk, I think it's unavoidable. Right now, the lens by which I see the world is through intense grief after having lost my mom. And I keep thinking, I sit down and I think about what I'm going to say on a Sunday, and I start writing, and it always comes through. And I keep thinking, they've heard enough of that, put that to the side. But it is the clothing that I am wearing in this season of life. And I'm sure that will morph into a different thing, right? There was the motherhood self, all of those things. But I think for me, if I had to sort of pin it down, liberation theology, I come to Scripture reading it as the literal poor or the literal disenfranchised, and not always the spiritually poor or the spiritually disenfranchised. And that's informed by my experiences as a brown woman growing up in a system that was not created for me. That's impacted even more by, if you've seen my twins, they look nothing like me. They're really white, blue eyes, red hair, and I feel some kind of way about raising children that get to inherit the earth just because of the way they look, and that get to deny that they have any Latino-ness in them at all if they wanted to. And I feel that pressure immensely. And then right now, just the grief is, it touches everything in my life at the moment.
I feel
Please,
like I've talked enough.
You never talk enough. Please keep going.
So I would say I approach this place, one as a black man. That's why, like, the whole betrayal thing, like, yo, ouch. Because I unwittingly allowed myself to become the token black guy for the longest time to white evangelicalism that, quite honestly, excuse my language, doesn't give a shit about me anymore. Because I had the audacity to speak up for my dignity as a human being, and then also include women and queer folk in that. And so I also come with the lens as a middle school youth pastor who, last night I got to go to a birthday gathering at a bar for one of my former students who turned 30. So like that still impacts and shapes me a lot. And last but not least, I would also say that aside from just the liberation part, just an understanding of this whole thing that is embodied. Because the thing that I feel like evangelicalism has taken a corner from, which is ironic because, and this is the nerd theology part, the original heresy was Gnosticism, which basically said that Jesus was a disembodied spirit. And yet everything about Christianity for the last 500 years is a byproduct of disembodying spirituality and faith. It is totally disconnected from an actual lived experience. So I've started to view it through a lens of, regardless of whether this stuff is literal or allegorical, what does it mean and what does it look like to actually embody this?
Blair, do you have something?
No, go.
So I think when I look at this passage, when I think about the lens that's continuing to form, so I think that's important. It's a process. It's an ongoing evolutionary process, not just, I would argue, for me, but for us as a community. For so many years, decades, being conditioned to think that there's like one particular way of reading or interpreting something. And if you can just find that one particular way and interpret, it's like, okay, now we have reached the final destination. We can speak with authority.
My own little personal spin, so it doesn't sound like plagiarism.
Yeah, for sure. But I think the permission that has been given here and the freedom, the liberation from living in such entrenched binary ways of understanding everything, not just Bible, but the impact of it having that impact on me. You know, when I look at a passage of scripture like this, I am given like reckless, wild amounts of freedom to go wherever my heart, mind, soul leads me. And then there's a stewardship that I practice in that process, acknowledging that I have teammates, I have a community that is relying on me to come to some place of having a first word and not a last word. This is the first word I would offer in this. There's more words than this. In fact, you might hear a word that's completely different next Sunday when David, Sean, or Blair, whoever stands up. You know, when I look at this passage, the thing that jumps off the page for me is who's not listed. It's a bunch of men. And so if you're living in a binary world, well, clearly the world should be ordered and organized through faith by a male-dominant voice. But when you're given permission to go, all right, well, what's not being said? There's a lot there to learn from. And so to have that freedom and then recognizing that you didn't come up with that type of a lens by yourself, that your community pulled you aside and said, hey, guess who's not being included? There's a transformative thing that happens in the way you can even move towards something. And to do that in community, I think, is what happens here on any given Sunday. It's hard because it's not one voice, but man, the payoff, the crock pot experience of that, I think is profound. Instapot version of that, right?
I think whenever I think about the lens that I speak from, it is a process, like Matt said, and it's continuing to evolve and develop. And I do think that me being an adult child of an alcoholic is a huge thing for me. And I think the church has been a huge part of me healing in that. Also, me being a children's pastor and working with students is big in that. And so whenever I do process scripture, there is a historical piece, there's a cultural piece, an inclusive piece, and there's a huge experiential piece that speaks into that. And so I wish that I could say that I trusted my voice a little more, but I think that adult child of an alcoholic, being a female in ministry and starting in the Southern Baptist Church, and being a middle child, I got to throw that in there, and being an Enneagram 6, I think all of those things, they still are part of me questioning if my voice has value or weight, or if I'm worthy to hold a microphone. And so that's the thing that I wrestle with, and that's the lens that is part of who I am.
I also feel that imposter syndrome, big time. Big time.
You know, part of the betrayal for me was hearing so many different sermons, and it's the same translation as what we're talking about. And it took me so long to realize I can't hear the same translation and be a new creation. And I need new information and new experience to step into my new self, have another part of my life be resurrected. And so the lens that I love to look through, and I just feel like this is very just innate for me and just very natural, is the lens of the intersection of psychology and theology. And so it allows me to look at it in a way and give it different words and different meanings that I hope will resonate in people's hearts, so that we don't have to leave here the same way we walked in here.
So we're going to start to land this plane in a second here. I guess the one thing I would add, and this isn't going to be a shocker for you, and probably the third of you in the room have hung out with me for a reclamation experience, but my lens would be probably the word contradiction. They poke fun at me for enjoying chaos, but what I really love is contradiction. And what I mean by that is, from the earliest moments of my life, which I remember, I mean, I look like this. I'm a straight white guy. So in many ways, like we've already said, this world, or at least this part of the world, is made for me. And yet, there's a part of me that has never fit. I didn't have language for that growing up. A lot of my faith journey was being drawn to some of the theologies that have been named liberation theology, the contradiction of God identifying with the most marginalized. And like, okay, there's something there. That sort of disrupts or short circuits what we expect God to be. Then I discovered queer theology. Hot damn. So good. Just the way that queer theology just undercuts these normative expectations of what God and identity is supposed to look like, and sort of makes non-normativity a kind of normativity. And I'm like, I love that. I'm also a straight cis person, you know. And really for me, it's been just understanding my own neurodiversity, autism, which is a relatively recent journey for me. I mean, it's a lifelong journey for me, turns out. It's a relatively recent lens for me, really in the past 2 or 3 years. It's like, aha, there it is. There's the contradiction. There is the way in which this world both is and is not built for me. And to then explore, encounter, and articulate the experience of God through that lens, and really now understand why I can appreciate the diverse lenses of the people in this room, both you and them, largely informs. I joke that, you know, I only preach one sermon over and over and over again, and eventually you'll get it. You will, I promise. But yeah, I think for me that would be it. So you know, we know that there's like football and stuff to get onto. So when we were thinking about ways to land this plane, Kim suggested prayer.
They shut me down. What is that?
Not all of us shot you down.
Thank you.
Also, and I think you'll get this over time from us. Prayer doesn't mean any one thing, you know. And one of my favorite parts, and I'm the person who supposedly on this team doesn't like prayer. False. What I got sick of was the sort of rote, sort of evangelical, daddy God with lots of the word just, you know, kind of prayers. Some of you are chuckling, some of you are nodding, some of you are in pain.
You are having flashbacks.
Yeah, but we didn't hate Kim's idea. What we kind of wanted to do is one kind of prayer is a benediction. It's leaving the congregation with something to hold on to, a lens, a word, a phrase, an idea, to cling to through that week, because then we'll come back and commune once again the next week. So the way we sort of messily thought we would do this is we're going to take turns giving you something to go out with. For some of us, it might be a word. For some of us, it might be an idea, an encouragement, a challenge. I don't know. I actually have no idea what they're going to say. I haven't even thought of what I'm going to say yet, so I'm going last. But
Right now.
Don't take mine.
Okay, looks like I'm going first. We jokingly said that I would call and you would hang up, and here we are, back to youth group from 10 years ago. I think my hope and prayer for our community is in our mission statement. We say that a different world is possible, and I think that I hope and pray that we realize that we really are the ones who can make our world different. And I mean that. I know that sounds cliche, but I mean that on a Sunday, on a Monday, on a Tuesday, in Charlotte, in whatever neighborhood you live in. I think you guys don't realize how different you make my world on a Sunday. And so I hope that you feel that way as well, and I hope that you carry that out as you go.
I think representation matters deeply, and I don't think that we represent everybody that's in this space. So my hope, my prayer, my wish is that you feel free to be in this space, and that freedom runs from everything, from any type of identity that you might have, any type of fear that you hold about who you might be. I hope that you feel free in this space to be who you are and to be who you're not as well.
Still forming. You got something?
Sure. I think I would just want you to think about what one relationship in your life gets the most attention, energy, thought. And is that relationship, whether it's a thing or a substance or work or a person or Jesus, is that relationship betraying you or actually connecting you?
Need a minute or two? Yeah, I'm still thinking. Still thinking?
I can go. I don't have to be. I don't have to be last.
The word permission surfaces for me, and it's surfacing not because of something necessarily that, I have experienced wild amounts of permission here, but part of the joy of the work that I get to do through the preface experience is almost universally every single time we move through that, someone names that as something that they didn't know they needed or didn't know they had. And so part of what happens, I think, in all of this, the disorientation, because again, like sometimes, like we will literally contradict ourselves or contradict each other on any given weekend, but it's within the theme or this base note of some of the things that Sean mentioned. You know, that is a way of giving you permission to make up your own mind and to go on the journey that you need to go on, and be invited into something that will have this death resurrection cycle. But if you lean into it within the context of community, there's something spectacular that not only happens to you, happens in you, and we would argue through you.
Priesthood of all.
What did you say?
You missed it. Too late.
Priesthood of all.
I guess I ended up being last anyway. I think my word would be vulnerability. If the theme of today was diversity, vulnerability is the one thing we all have in common. Insofar as I still identify as a Christian, and I do, despite the protests of many, I would say that vulnerability is a synonym for humanity. And I think a succinct way of defining the gospel would be that humanity is a synonym for divinity. So vulnerability, humanity, divinity, synonyms with each other. And insofar as prayer means anything to me at all at this point in my life, prayer is a posture of vulnerability. Think of the ways, stereotypically, historically, that we posture literally in prayer. Closing your eyes, can't see what's coming. Bowing your head, your neck is exposed. Kneeling, folding your hands, can't defend yourself. It's modeling bodily. We've talked about being embodied this morning. It's modeling bodily the one thing we have in common, not only with each other, but with God. That collective humanity, collective vulnerability, that in some paradoxical, contradictory fashion is, in fact, the very image of the divine inside of us. So my hope for you, my prayer for you, quite literally, is that you experience a little bit of vulnerability this week, not in any sort of traumatic, terrifying sense, but in a grounding sense, the sense that brings you back to yourself, first and foremost, the sense that brings you back to God. And then I think Christ is quite clear in this. To come back to God is to come back to one another. When we're truly vulnerable and we can identify with that, we're free to be with and for one another. And that's my prayer. I think probably all of our prayer for you this week. So thank you for being here. We have to sit on stage because Samantha wants to take a picture of us. But then after that, well, we'll be hanging out in the back, happy to talk to you, especially if you're new. We would love to meet you. But wonderful, wonderful to see you all this morning, and we'll hopefully see you next week.